אני גאה להמשיך ולשתף בהרצאה מוקלטת ששלח לנו הישר מארצות הברית מר מיכאל בונן, בנו של רב יהודי בצבא האמריקאי, אשר הגיע יחד עם החיילים לשחרר את המחנות, הצבא האמריקאי ותנועת הבריחה. מיכאל, אשר מאוד רצה להגיע להשתתף בכנס אך נבצר ממנו, מדבר בהרצאתו על הדרך שבה הרבנים הצבאיים וגם החיילים שאינם יהודים סייעו לתנועת הבריחה.
The United States Army's role in the defeat of the Nazis and the liberation of the concentration camps is widely appreciated. I would like to discuss the Army's role in the Bricha, which is much less well known. After the victory in Europe, it was the United States Army that administered the areas in Germany and Austria where most of the Jewish displaced persons found themselves. While most non-Jewish DPs went back to their countries of origin, the Jews could not do that, and as you know, Britain was opposed to their immigrating to Palestine. The circumstances of those Jewish survivors immediately after liberation was very bad. General George Patton, who was responsible for the DP's condition, was of no help. He actually wrote that Jewish DPs are lower than animals. President Truman sent Earl Harrison, the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, to Europe to report on the situation. Harrison reported that he saw that Jews were being held under armed guard, behind barbed wire, in crowded and unsanitary conditions, with insufficient food, and sometimes in the very camps where they had been victimized. He wrote Truman saying, "We appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them." Unlike General Patton, there were American soldiers who worked to help improve the lot of the Jewish DPs and to facilitate their illegal immigration to Israel, sometimes at their own risk. I'm going to tell you about 3 men in the U.S. Army who were helpful to the DPs and the Bricha. 2 of them were non-Jews. I'm going to focus on the third person because he was my father, Rabbi Eli Bonen, Zichrono Livracha, who was a chaplain in an infantry division. His story has been documented in several books, but also in his daily letters from Europe to my mother. First, some background. My father was a conservative rabbi in Buffalo, New York, when the war began. He volunteered to join the Army and was assigned to the 42nd Infantry Division, which was known as the Rainbow Division. The Rainbow Division landed in Marseille, and as you can see, they pursued the Nazis through France and Germany and ended up in Austria. There were over 500,000 Jews in the American Armed Forces in World War II. When the Rainbow Division was fighting in Germany on Pesach in March 1945, my father arranged a Seder for the 750 Jews in the division. He even created a special short Haggadah for the soldiers. This is a copy of the Rainbow Haggadah. They used an old printing press, which they cleaned with some Nazi flags, which my father said for once served a useful purpose. The second person I want to talk about is the general in charge of the division, Harry Collins. My father gained the trust of General Collins, and Collins became sympathetic to the plight of the Jews. My father invited him to the Seder, and here's a photo of the general speaking to the Jewish soldiers at that Seder. 1 month after Pesach, the Rainbow Division participated in the liberation of Dachau. They found more than 30 railroad cars filled with bodies of prisoners who died of starvation on the way to the camp. Then they entered the camp and found around 32,000 prisoners who were still alive. My father was the first rabbi to enter Dachau upon its liberation, to see the dead and to meet with the survivors. As my father wrote to my mother, "We saw freight cars with bodies in them. We entered the camp and saw the living. The Jews were the worst off. Many of them were worse than the dead. They cried as they saw us. I spoke to a large group of Jews. No possible punishment would ever repay the ones who were responsible." The war soon ended, and the Rainbow Division was assigned to administer the area around Salzburg, Austria. My father began working closely with a number of DP camps in that area. One of them was called Reidenberg, another was Bad Gastein. Abba Geffen, Meir's father, worked closely with my father. He wrote a history of the Bricha, Portzei HaMachsomim, and an English edition, Defying the Holocaust. I'll be quoting some excerpts from the English edition. Geffen wrote, "The conditions in the Reidenburg camp were very bad. Dozens of families lived together in large rooms. The Jewish chaplain, Rabbi Bonnén, was a very nice man with a warm Jewish heart. He arranged for the improvement of their conditions and received the approval of the American Army to transfer to us several blocks of buildings outside the city, which previously housed American soldiers. Families could now live as separate units. We called this camp New Palestine." In recognition of his work, my father was made an honorary citizen of New Palestine. The certificate you see says, "You were amongst the first to advise our brethren in America of our physical and spiritual suffering, and through your efforts we have been afforded the opportunity of improving our position. Day and night, without regard to interruptions, you still continue with your practical good deeds for the welfare of our community, ready at all times to rush to our assistance." My father sent a photo to my mother with a note that said, "These are some of the kids I've been trying to help." This is my favorite photo from that period. My father saw that many needs were not being met. He wrote a letter to my mother asking her to get people to send packages for the DPs. He wrote, "I need soap, toothbrushes, toothpaste, food, Yiddish papers, clothing. The clothing must be new or must look like new. The morale of the people is such that I wouldn't give them old stuff." My father also asked his Jewish soldiers to write home asking for help. Within a month, over 500 packages had arrived. Eventually, over 50 tons of supplies were delivered. In his book on the Bricha, entitled Flight and Rescue, Yehuda Bauer, who recently passed away, wrote that the treatment of the Jews differed significantly between other divisions and the 42nd due to a package project instituted by Chaplain Eli Bonnén and by the benevolent interest of the very friendly commander, General Harry J. Collins. Collins told Eli to come directly to him, bypassing his chief of staff anytime he had a question regarding the Jewish DPs. Many of the DPs, of course, wanted to go to Palestine, but the official position of the army was that it could not help them because of British opposition. British Prime Minister Clement Attlee warned Truman that advocating Jewish emigration to Palestine could not fail to do grievous harm to relations between our two countries and could precipitate a grave crisis. In defying the Holocaust, Geffen wrote, "Officially, Chaplain Bonnén was liaison officer between the military commander of the American zone of Austria and the Jewish refugees. Like so many American officers and soldiers, he lent his utmost aid to the refugees, even if it meant endangering his position. Jews from the New World were resolved to redeem and rescue the survivors of the Holocaust and to inspire them with hope for peace and safety. Their help was doubly precious because it came before any organization of protection and rescue had begun to function. Bonnén helped the Bricha people a great deal, being careful always to remind them, 'I know nothing of all your illegal activities.' Wink, wink. Our American friends helped the Bricha to the point of even covering up for all its illegal actions. When one of them was asked why they were doing it, he replied, 'I was in the 42nd Division, which liberated the Dachau extermination camp.' In fact, DPs were forging rubber stamps and simulating Italian, French, American, and British approvals so that survivors could travel to Italy on their way to Palestine. Geffen wrote, 'Our American friends helped the Bricha to the point of even covering up for its illegal actions.' My father wrote my mother that he wanted to get every Jew possible into Palestine, and he told her about helping to set up a transit camp for them. He was secretly helping the Bricha and wrote that if it were known what he and an assistant were doing, they could have been court-martialed. But he also felt that General Collins would be sympathetic to their work with the DPs. He wrote to her in November 1945, 'Don't mention this to anyone, but there exists here an underground organization which transports Jews out of Poland and sneaks them across borders and into Italy. They're highly organized and are doing very difficult and dangerous work. There's a soldier from Palestine in charge of the secret organization. We have a committee of Jews in Salzburg that has set itself up as a central committee for all Austria. They're smuggling Jews across borders with forged documents. The movement of Jews through Austria is an historic event in Jewish history, and Salzburg is a strategic spot. When the story of the Jewish underground is written, it will indeed be something to marvel at. In my small way, I'm able to help. The British were concerned that the U.S. Army was facilitating illegal immigration. Later that month, Ernest Bevins, the British Foreign Secretary, announced the formation of an Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry on Palestine. When the committee came to Bad Gastein, the Jews planned a demonstration. General Collins said he didn't want a demonstration, but about 1,000 Jews gathered in the street with banners reading "Palestine or death," "Down with the English white paper," etc. The next day, the general addressed the DPs, as my father translated his remarks into Yiddish. General Collins said he was disappointed that they disobeyed his orders, but then asked how he could help them. My father said that General Collins took advantage of every opportunity he could to help the Jews. While they were in Bad Gastein, the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry met with my father and interrogated him at great length, unsuccessfully trying to find out about any illegal activities of the Bricha. The British members of the committee were especially hostile. My father then introduced them to Jews who explained that all they wanted was to go to Palestine. Ultimately, the commission made a recommendation that 100,000 Jews be let into Palestine, but the British rejected it. As I mentioned, Bad Gastein became a transit camp for the Bricha. James Rice of the Joint Distribution Committee worked with my father. He wrote, "Bad Gastein was a most fortunate choice because it was located on a highway to Italy. Officers and GIs unofficially aided thousands of Jews to go to Bad Gastein and on to Italy as part of the illegal immigration to Palestine." One of the soldiers who worked with my father on behalf of the Jewish DPs was a non-Jewish American who spoke Polish, Stanley Nowinski. Like my father and General Collins, Nowinski had participated in the liberation of Dachau. His efforts on behalf of the displaced persons was so impactful that when he visited Israel in 1973, a grove of trees was planted by the Bricha, and he was praised as a righteous Gentile for his extraordinary support of the Bricha. The Bricha estimated that 120,000 Jews passed through the transit camp, many under the guise of being Italians on their way to Palestine. Captain Nowinski said, "They said they were Italians going back to Italy. I heard them speaking in Polish. So I just didn't look too carefully at their birth certificates, which looked like they were just recently printed." There were new pogroms in Poland. This was a rescue mission, evacuating the survivors of the Holocaust to a place of safety. They were organized by young but experienced partisan fighters who were determined to get their people to their homeland in spite of all obstacles and difficulties. Abba Geffen wrote that Nowinski was truly a righteous person, our unfailing protector in all our troubles and mishaps, who had undergone so much, had risked his career, and endured vilification for his humanity. In late December 1945, my father was called into the general's office together with Nowinski. The general said that higher headquarters had decided to give tacit approval to cooperation with the Bricha. The approval was classified as secret, and if referred to, would be denied. Nowinski later wrote, "The most important assistance came from the Jewish chaplain, who became unofficially involved with the illegal refugees. We were fortunate to have Rabbi Bonnén, who had been with us in combat and already had the respect of the officers and men in the army, and an understanding of the problems of the Jewish survivors. His sincere, diligent, and patient efforts to cooperate, coordinate, and help all resulted in better conditions and care for the survivors and more goodwill for them from the military. The conditions in the camp were the best in the U.S. zones of occupation. He was devoting much of his time aiding the survivors coming from Eastern Europe who were in great need." On my father's last day at Bad Gastein, the DPs gave him an album of photos of their work together. It documented their fight to make Aliyah. Even in Bad Gastein, we are fighting for a free access to Palestine. It also had photos of a school they set up, a drama group, political parties, a newspaper, and vocational training for adults. After all the horrors of the camps, undoubtedly suffering from what we now call PTSD, these survivors showed incredible resilience, organizing themselves for a new life. They gave my father a 4-by-6-foot drawing showing a group of refugees waving goodbye. This drawing is now in a museum in New York. I want to thank you very much for the honor of telling you about this chapter in the history of the Bricha. I wish you hatzlacha in your efforts to share this heroic story